Hello?
One second, you started the broadcast.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay. So now I know what to do, but not that. Okay. Is this working?
Yes, so we have a few attendees online, so bear with us, attendees, and we will start in about 20 minutes. So, Catherine, we can go ahead and mute ourselves, okay?
Sure. Sounds good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the FASEB webinar, Summer Advocacy Activities for Scientists. We will begin in about 1 minute. I can see that we still have some people joining us. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the FASEB webinar, Summer Advocacy Activities for Scientists. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Jennifer Zeitzer, and I'm the Director of Legislative Relations here at FASEB. We have two outstanding speakers who will be with us this afternoon as well, too. My colleague, Dr. Benjamin Krinsky, is the Senior Legislative Affairs Officer at FASEB. And we have a special guest today, Catherine Brain, who is a graduate student at Columbia University in New York in the doctoral program in neurobiology and behavior. She previously served as a research assistant at the Jackson Laboratory in Maine and is a proud graduate of Mount Holyoke College. She's going to give a first-person account and experience of what it's like to engage in advocacy locally by someone who's done it and has quite a bit of experience, in part because Catherine is one of the Society for Neuroscience's early career policy ambassadors. A few housekeeping announcements before we get started today. We do have everybody on mute to minimize any interference on the line, but I assure you that we will still have plenty of time for questions and answers. We are simply going to ask that folks send us their questions in writing using the feature on our GoToWebinar platform, and I will review that in a moment. But we'll go ahead and get started with a quick review of our agenda today. We're going to talk a little bit about the fiscal year 2019 appropriations process, because believe it or not, that's where we are here in Washington. Go over what scientists can do to engage in advocacy, talk about some resources available from FASEB, and then turn it over to Catherine to let her walk you through her experience, and also talk about resources that are available from the Society for Neuroscience. And then we will finish up today with Q&A. So to ask a question, you can use the feature here on the GoToWebinar platform. Don't worry, we do not correct for spelling or grammar mistakes. And you can submit your question at any time during the webinar. If you think of something right now, go ahead and send that in. If not, we can deal with all of them at the end. So we will do the presentations and then do all questions at the end. For those who are not familiar with FASEB, we are a federation of 30 societies, and we collectively represent over 130,000 researchers across the United States and in other parts of the world. Advocacy is a really core part of the mission of what we do here at FASEB, and that's part of the reason why we are hosting this webinar today. For those of you who may be a member of a FASEB society, here are the logos of all of our current members. Thank you so much for being a member, and those of you who are not but might be interested in learning about what it's like to be a member of a professional society, we do encourage you to check out our organizations, and if you're interested, apply for membership. Membership has lots of different benefits, not the least of which is access to information and including the FASEB information. So we're at a pretty interesting point here in Washington. It's summertime, but surprisingly, the Congress has actually made quite a bit of progress on the fiscal year 2019 appropriations or spending bills. We will use those terms interchangeably throughout this webinar. Fiscal year 2019 actually does not begin until October 1 of this year, but it takes so long for Congress to put the budget together that they really start a month ahead of time. While this has not really made a lot of headlines, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, who have the primary responsibility for all spending decisions, have really approved nearly all of the 2019 spending bills over the last couple of months. It's been a quiet process, and we should see everything completed next month in July. There's still a few more bills that are being reviewed by the committees, but for the most part, they're on track to get things wrapped up shortly after July 4th. The bills, once they're approved by the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, that is only the first step in the process. They must then next be approved and passed by the entire House and the entire Senate. And that process is underway now as well, too. Yesterday, or I believe it was Monday actually, the Senate passed a package of 3 bills, which they called a mini-bus. It was the Energy and Water Legislative Branch and the Military Veterans Bill that funds, among other things, the Department of Energy Office of Science. This mini-bus bill that the Senate passed was actually passed by the House a couple of weeks ago. They're in different formats, so that you have to go through the whole process of making those line up line by line, word for word in the same version. And we might see that later this summer. We also expect to see that there may be additional these mini buses that go to the House and Senate floor in July and August. We don't have a schedule yet, but they're making such good progress that we think they might continue. That being said, the final outcome of the appropriations process, unfortunately, is a giant question mark, and Ben and I have been trying to game this out ourselves and haven't really reached any conclusions. But we do know this. Fiscal year 2019, as I noted earlier, begins on October 1, 2018. That's just a fact. The midterm elections will certainly delay progress on these spending bills. We do not believe that Congress will pass the 2019 budget by that October 1 deadline, even if they do get a lot of work done this summer. We're going to see a sort of slowdown in activity probably after 4th of July that will continue through late fall. The only way to keep the lights on and avoid a government shutdown if Congress doesn't do its job by October 1 is to have Congress pass what's called a continuing resolution. It's a short-term budget agreement. And we know that one of these is coming down the pike. We are under a continuing resolution every year in the fall. How long this one will last is anyone's guess, but most certainly you'll start to hear the phrase continuing resolution starting in September. The good news, even further, not only have we made some progress, the recommendations coming out of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee are very positive for biomedical research and physical sciences research pretty much across the board. This chart shows the status of the funding as in the bills that have been approved by these committees. So for NIH, it's a race between the House and the Senate who gets the higher number. So far, the Senate's winning. Yesterday, the committee approved a bill that would provide $39.1 billion for NIH. That's another $2 billion increase, or about 5.45% over the current level funding. The House came in a little bit lower at $1.25 billion. So the final number will wind up somewhere between 1.25 and 2 billion. For the National Science Foundation, again, it's the House and Senate working to see who can be more generous to NSF. You have a 5% increase that was approved by the House and a 4% from the Senate, and then the final number will wind up somewhere in between there. And similar good news for the Department of Energy, Office of Science, the Veterans Administration Medical and Prosthetic Research Program, and then the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, which is run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That is the competitive grant program that USDA runs. So all in all, some good news moving forward on these bills if Congress can get its job done later this fall. And that's really what the purpose of this webinar is, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can help. Part of the reason why we are in this position with Congress being quite generous right now with regard to research is because back in March, Congress approved an overall budget agreement that increased the spending limit for 2019. So they literally put more money on the table for the appropriations committees to carve up and allocate to the different agencies and programs. And so we want to make sure that we're screaming very loudly to make sure that that money comes to the science agencies. There's strong bipartisan support in Congress for the research agencies. We've seen that building over the last couple of years. Right now, it shows no sign of slowing down, which is terrific. So we had, more than 200 members of the House in March signed a letter saying that they supported a $2 billion increase in fiscal year 2019. I really think that made a huge difference in the numbers that were coming out of the Appropriations Committee. Similarly, lots of support for increased funding for NSF. We're still run into, as part of FASEB's advocacy program, many members of Congress who are just not aware of how much money their districts and states are receiving from NIH and NSF and the other agencies. And later on, Ben's going to talk a little bit about the resources we have to get that information to them. And, this can't be ignored. We had important primaries last night in several states. Voters are paying attention to constituents. Members of Congress are paying attention to constituents because of the midterm elections in November. So as a citizen, as a voter, you have a real opportunity to make your voice heard. One thing we always like to talk about when we're trying to get other scientists engaged in advocacy is throwing some data at you. And why do we think advocacy makes a difference? Well, certain things speak for themselves. Multiple $2 billion increases for NIH over the last couple of years. That's not an accident. That's because of advocacy. But we also know that some survey work has shown that when we talked to members of Congress and their staff, 88% of congressional staff said that receiving an email has some or a lot of influence. So even though it seems like an impersonal way to connect with your member of Congress, email really helps. Social media posts are really having an increased impact these days. And what was a surprising finding to me was 45% of the staff surveyed said that as few as 30 comments about a specific issue on social media would be enough to gain attention from members of Congress. We've actually thought it would be much more given how hard it is to break through these days. And 50% said social media makes members of Congress more accountable to constituents. So this really has become social media has become a way to reach out to your elected officials. In terms of what comes next, I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and he's going to talk not only about the goals of our advocacy efforts, but the resources that we have available to help you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jennifer. First, I just want to go over some information, sort of the big picture here with our advocacy efforts, particularly this spring and summer. So you can really think about the fact that we have both short and long-term goals for our current advocacy efforts. So in the short term, no less important than the long term, of course, is that we want you as advocates to inform your elected officials about the biological and biomedical research that is happening in the states and districts represented by your members of Congress. As Jennifer already alluded to, it's actually quite surprising to learn just how many members of Congress are really unaware of the science that is happening close to their homes. And then also, as Jennifer alluded to in her description of where things stand for fiscal year 2019, our big push at the moment is to encourage our elected officials, your elected officials, to support the proposed funding increases for NIH, NSF, and the other science funding agencies. Now, in the longer term, there's it's true to say that in politics, sort of being effective in the long term is really a matter of building relationships, and so we see these longer term effects of our efforts, hopefully, will be to build better relationships with members of Congress for a number of reasons. First of all, we want to build on our recent advocacy successes. As many, if not all of you know, these last couple of years have been quite good, especially for the budget of the NIH. So we want to really build on that momentum and keep Congress pushing forward with increases for NIH and the other science agencies. As I was alluding to, another avenue we'd like to pursue here is to develop working relationships between you and your senators and representatives. The better that your member of Congress or your senator gets to know you, the stronger an advocate they can be when they come back to Washington and work on these appropriations bills and other legislation. And then, of course, in the very long term, we see this as a process of education. We really want to help your elected officials to understand the broad importance of life sciences research for our entire country. Obviously, most politicians are concerned with their local states and local districts, but really life sciences research in general benefits the entire country. And I think it's true to say that the champions we've had in Congress these last few years really understand that this is an investment in the long-term health and capacity to innovate of our nation. So we encourage you all to take action. There are many ways that you can do that, from a relatively short time commitment to a little bit more involvement. First, you can simply make a phone call. You can contact your members of Congress, make your voice heard. We encourage you to use social media to connect with your elected officials. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. We encourage you to attend public appearances by your elected officials. For example, town hall meetings are a good way for you to live and in person engage with your members of Congress. And one thing we're going to emphasize particularly today is how to meet with your representatives and senators when they are back home for these various upcoming summer recess activities. So I'll say more about that over the next few slides. I do want to say that just in general, our website is sort of a one-stop shop for advocacy resources. If you go to our website, www.faseb.org, and click on the tab entitled Science, Policy, Advocacy, and Communications, you'll see there's a little link that says Become an Advocate, and that's really, again, where you can find a whole wealth of information about how to be an advocate for life sciences research. So I'm going to talk in more detail about some of that material over the next few slides. First, you might be wondering if I want to reach out to my member of Congress, how do I actually do that, or how do I get their contact information? Well, we have a very useful tool on our website. Again, under the Become an Advocate link there's a tab you'll see called Legislative Action Center, and you'll see a window that looks something like this. and you can just enter your zip code, and it will give you information about how to get in touch with your member of Congress. Sometimes it will ask you for a street address because the way legislative districts are drawn, sometimes a zip code is split by multiple congressional districts. And I also want to say here, we encourage you to put in your address for both where your home, where you live, and also the office where you work, because sometimes both your place of work and your home actually fall in different congressional districts. So that's one way you can reach more members of Congress. So if you put in your information, you'll get an output that looks something like this. This is just an example. Representative Tom Cole, of course, chairs the subcommittee in the House of Representatives that oversees the budget for NIH. But really importantly, the information that's provided on this, using this web resource, not only gives you the contact information for your members of Congress here in Washington, D.C., but as I've been alluding to, also gives you the information for their local offices close to where you live and work. So again, we're making this big push. We're encouraging all of you to meet your officials locally. As I've mentioned, our website has a whole host of information. I'll talk a little bit more about some of that, about how to set up these meetings. And when you reach out, this is a good way. This is a good way to sort of form a relationship with the staff in your local offices. We're emphasizing these local meetings now, again, because we're coming up on congressional recesses when members of Congress will be back home. But in fact, you can reach out and set up meetings with staff in local offices at any time. These are meant to be staffed to serve the constituents, and so you can really you can reach out to them at any time of the year. And in particular, there are good resources to ask about public appearances. When will your members of Congress be home? When will they be attending town hall meetings? When will they have constituent office hours, host coffee breaks with constituents, all that kind of thing. Just a quick word on when the Congress will be in recess. Just coming up in a week or so is the July 4th recess. So both the House and Senate members of the House and Senate will be home for July 4th and the days around it. The House of Representatives will then have a summer recess, sort of their usual summer recess schedule, beginning roughly at the end of July and going through early September, so they'll be home for the month of August. The Senate has a slightly truncated break this year for a whole host of political reasons, but as I was saying, we still encourage you to reach out to your local Senate offices, even if your senator is not necessarily at home, again, because these offices do have staff who work with constituents all year round. So on our website, we have a whole page dedicated to how to request a meeting. This is a sort of in the category of our best practices set of resources. This website even includes a sample email text, so you can really just copy and paste the text and then fill in your own personal information. It's a really easy way to just shoot off a quick email to the staff in the local office to try and set up a meeting. We also have a lot of information about how to plan your meeting, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about the kinds of things you want to do in preparation for a meeting with a staff member or a member of Congress. So we have here a list of tips for having a successful meeting. You can think of these as sort of meeting best practices or sort of rules of thumb. The first and most important thing is to be prepared for your meeting. This is especially important for those of you who haven't perhaps done this kind of political advocacy or outreach before. In Washington speak, we want to make sure that you know what your ask is. That is, what specifically would you like your member of Congress to do? And one also kind of, I would say, corollary to this is to determine if your legislator is actually on any of the relevant committees related to the science budgets, particularly the Appropriations Committee that oversees the amount of money that the agencies actually get. Secondly, we encourage you to do your homework. So check the member of Congress's website. You can see how they vote if you go to congress.gov. And you can also look at their social media and other online materials to see their positions on relevant issues. If they've said anything about science, if they have any particular view on research, on life sciences in particular, it's a good way to kind of get a sense of where your member of Congress is on these issues, and therefore how you might be more persuasive with your message. We encourage you to gather relevant materials, and I'll say more about some of these resources in a moment. But we have a whole host of resources you can download for free from our website. We encourage you to do that. You can print out copies of all these materials and bring them with you. Congressional staff enjoy getting this material. They really do use it as a reference when they're moving forward and thinking about sort of legislative decisions. And I want to say a word about follow-up. It's important after your meetings to stay in touch. first, it's just simply a matter of courtesy. You want to follow up your visits with an email thanking the member of Congress or the staff you meet with, and also briefly summarize what you talked about. These people do get a lot of emails, they do take a lot of meetings, so you want to remind them who you are and why you spoke to them. And it's important to reiterate your ask. In this case, you want to emphasize the fact that it's important for Congress to finish the FY19 appropriations process and include these increases for research. Again, in the vein of building sort of a longer-term relationship, we encourage you to keep in touch with your legislator through occasional correspondence and visits to your local office. Again, this is a way to kind of maintain that two-way street so that they're a better representative of you and will be stronger supporters of science going forward. And last but not least, after your meeting, be sure to follow through on any commitments you made to the staff. This is very, very important. If they ask for a particular piece of information, or they ask for, say, an electronic version of one of our fact sheets, it's important that you do follow up on that. Again, it's a matter of courtesy, but it's also a way of maintaining lines of communication and ensuring that they have the information that they need to be more effective in Congress. So as I mentioned, we have a whole lot of information you're welcome to use. We encourage you to do so. Perhaps best known are our state and district fact sheets. Again, if you go to our website, there's a federal funding data link, and then you can find a map that looks like the image on the left-hand side, and then you click on an individual state, and another window will pop up which has a list of fact sheets both for the entire state, but also for congressional districts throughout that state. So you can open up PDFs which show how much science funding is actually going to each of these congressional districts and states. And this is really a very valuable a piece of information, again, because many legislators simply don't know the resources that are coming to their states to support research and education activities. So this is something that they find very useful as they're making these decisions. We have additional federal funding data. We have a lot of detailed information about trends in NIH research funding, as well as other information about grant success rates and so forth. So again, we encourage you to browse this information. It can be useful in your discussions. Also want to call your attention to our federal funding recommendations. These are we produce every year. They outline our recommendations for what we would like the agency budgets to be in a given fiscal year. We have a PDF brochure you can download. It has a concise description of each of the agencies that we track, as well as justifications for why we believe they deserve this increased support. And I also want to call your attention to the link underneath the federal funding recommendations, federal funding research cases. These are stories. These are examples of why these investments in basic life sciences research are leading to such important discoveries for our health and for our capacity to innovate and so forth. We also have an NSF-specific themed fact sheet. We advocate for the NIH, the NSF, and a whole host of other agencies. To draw a little bit more attention to the National Science Foundation, we encourage you to take a look at this fact sheet and feel free to bring it with you. Talks a little bit about what the kind of broad scientific portfolio that the NSF funds, as well as a little bit of more information about sort of the recent funding for the agency and some examples of important life sciences research areas that are supported by NSF. Like I said, please do take a look at our website. We have a lot of more advocacy resources than I've even touched on here. I want to mention briefly, we have something called the Value of Federal Funding, Value of Federally Funded Biological Research slide deck. This is a sort of ready-made PowerPoint presentation that goes through step by step all the reasons why investments in basic life sciences research is so critical. And I also want to say that coming soon, we will have an updated one-page fact sheet on the value of biological research. So this is a sort of a handy one-page handout about the importance of life sciences research. Another dimension to our local advocacy that I also want to draw your attention to is we encourage you to invite officials to visit your laboratory. So again, this is another coming attraction. We will have a FASEB guide to hosting a lab visit. But we do encourage you to invite members of Congress and or their staff to visit your laboratory. This is, again, a wonderful way for them to learn about what is happening in their states and districts. They can see firsthand the important research that is happening close to home. Again, it helps build personal relationships with congressional offices. And ultimately, it does help your member of Congress to be a better advocate in Washington. If they can come back to DC with a story in mind about the kind of really amazing cutting edge research happening in their home district, that just makes them that much more likely to support the sciences going forward. And last but not least, of course, such a visit introduces your members of Congress to real scientists. It's an unfortunate reality that most members of Congress, most private citizens actually don't know a professional scientist. So please do make the introduction. We encourage you to also connect with us on social media. Here's just a list of sample tweets that you can use to encourage Congress to finish the FY19 appropriations process and provide these robust increases for science funding. Our FASEB handle is @FASEB.org. Another dimension of advocacy that some of you might be interested in pursuing is to submit a letter or op-ed to your local newspaper. We've had quite a bit of success in recent years getting the word out about why these investments are so important. Often op-eds or letters to the editor in local media is a good way to reach constituents in places where they might not otherwise hear about these things. So if you are interested in drafting or submitting a letter or op-ed, we have information on our website with sort of a guide of how to do this. And please we're happy to work with you. Our communications team can work with you to get these published in various media outlets. Last but not least, for my part of things, some other tools to stay engaged. We encourage you to sign up to receive our e-action alerts. These are email alerts that go out whenever there's something really pressing happening on Capitol Hill. For example, if Congress is on the verge of passing an appropriations package, includes funding for research, we want everyone to, at that moment, email and call their members of Congress to encourage them to pass the bill, that sort of thing. So if you sign up for our e-action alerts, you'll get those notifications. Please subscribe to the bi-weekly Washington Update newsletter. This is our sort of blog about current scientific affairs in Washington. It's a great way to learn about what's happening inside the Beltway with regard to not only Congress, but also other policy matters, for example, things happening in the various executive branch agencies. And I've already mentioned Twitter, but please do follow us on social media. Our Twitter handle is @FASEB.org. And please also follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/FASEB.org.
Thank you, Ben. Catherine, why don't we have you take it away, and then we will wrap up the webinar with our Q&A portion.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. My name is Catherine. I am a graduate student at Columbia University, and this past year I am an ECPA fellow for the Society for Neuroscience. So I figured I'd take this opportunity to kind of talk about the advocacy and outreach that I've been involved in since I started graduate school, and also introduce what the Society for Neuroscience does and some of the advocacy tools that are available through them. So the Society for Neuroscience is a large nonprofit organization of neuroscientists around the world. And apart from hosting an annual meeting and publishing 2 separate neuroscience journals, they also are passionately involved in educating and engaging the public and advocating for the field, which includes meeting with legislators. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SFN advocacy initiatives, which include Capitol Hill Day, and also some of the outreach and education initiatives that are done by the Society, and also some of the ways that small groups of scientists at Columbia University have been able to reach out to the community as well. So one of the things that SFN offers, which is very similar to what FASEB offers as well, is that there's an advocacy action network that you could sign up for on the website, and there's a monthly publication about different things that are happening in Washington and how you can get involved, and some things, and the Advocacy Action Center lists things that you could do, anywhere from calling your congressional office and raising a point about some sort of legislation that's going through the House, or just simply sending a tweet in order to get that social media attention. And in addition to the monthly alerts, there's generally a weekly email that's sent out to alert you to these as well if you sign up. So the thing that I've been involved in since 2015 has been SFN's Capitol Hill Day. So each spring, the organization organizes neuroscientists to meet with their representatives in Washington, D.C. And basically, this is an opportunity to meet with your legislator or their staffers to discuss advances in the field, and also to share the economic and public health benefits of investment in biomedical research. And basically, you're making a case for continued investment in the NIH and the NSF, and you're offering yourself as a resource and developing a relationship with your congressional office in order to be there when they need expertise in your field. And these are really important relationships that are great to maintain. So this past year, we actually visited about 93 congressional offices on the Hill, and we met with 12 members of Congress directly, and 25 states were represented, which was quite a success for us. And we're following this up with local outreach this summer. A lot of local Society for Neuroscience chapters are trying to meet with congressmen and senators over break, which is something that I'm helping to organize now for our local New York City group. Another thing that is related to SFN is that they have SFN Capitol Hill Day is the Early Career Policy Ambassador Program, of which I'm one this year. And what this program does is that it trains scientists to engage with legislators. And so we receive training in DC before we meet with legislators. And we also are party to the action alerts that the Society for Neuroscience sends out. And over a year, you propose an initiative that you want to undertake in your home district. And members of the society meet with all of us once a month and offer advice and support in any way that they can to try to get our ideas and our projects off the table. So this is something that if you're interested in advocacy and you particularly identify as a neuroscientist, is possibly something you could look into to get the training that you want in order to do advocacy. So one of the most important parts of the training before we visit the Hill is developing an elevator pitch. Over the past couple of years, I've met staffers and congressmen from anywhere from 5 minutes to about a half hour. And some of these meetings were actually in hallways while walking. So being able to try to have a short, sweet conversation about what you were, to introduce yourself and to introduce your researcher and introduce your research to someone who might know absolutely nothing about biology, and then also get your asks in with respect to the funding is something that you really need to be able to do in a very short period of time. So some advice that we have for elevator pitches is that they need to be short and sweet, and you can't use jargon at all. And furthermore, you need to contextualize your research and put it in a bigger picture, and also tailor it to your audience. So for example, I know that it was presented that you could look and to do your homework before going to visit congressmen and to know a little bit about them. So for example, in one meeting, we found out that one particular congressman, his mother was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So the member of our group who worked on Alzheimer's was the person to lead the group meeting. Also, if not everyone works on diseases are kind of immediately relevant. So if you work on disease, it's a little bit easier to have an elevator pitch that kind of contextualizes your research in a way that shows that it's needed for the public. But if you're doing more basic research, there are some resources that are available that help to kind of allow you to present it in a way that contextualizes it within society. And so there's some stuff on brainfacts.org, and then also Research America has some great resources in order to do this as well. So I'm showing you guys an example of basically what my original elevator pitch was versus what it became. So it's really important that if you're going with a group or you're going by yourself to practice with and critique your peers on their elevator speeches. And basically what you want is something, and I know this applies to me at least, is that you want to be able to explain your research as like your grandmother could understand it. So instead of talking about the pathways that you study or using super technical language, if you could just use layman's terms and also talk about the main goal of what you're trying to be. One of the biggest stereotypes about scientists is actually that we could be a little bit condescending when talking about our work, and that's a stereotype that you definitely want to combat. because you want to be able to offer yourself as a resource, and you are going there to ask for things. Another thing that comes up is you're asking, generally when you go to these meetings, you're asking for increased funding for the NIH and the NSF, and you really kind of want to make the struggle real. It's very hard to get an R01 these days. And so if you are a PI or you're applying for these grants, you really want to talk about the percentage of people that actually get them. And if you have one of these grants, or if you're funded in any way by the NIH or the NSF, you want to highlight your accomplishments and tell a personal story. So for example, this past year, my grant was actually in a study section while I was meeting with a member of Congress, and that came up, and I was like, and so that was actually a way, and that actually became a conversation, especially for me as a graduate student trying to get my first grant. And so just explaining the hoops that you need to jump through to be funded is really important, because a lot of times people have absolutely no idea how the funding process works. And another thing that commonly comes up that we're asked about is that, what about philanthropy? Can't scientists get money from big pharmaceutical companies? And while this is true, and scientists are funded in a variety of different ways, the case that we make is that it's not as sustainable. And also at the same time, it's the NIH and the NSF are the only groups that are paying for training of young scientists. And that's not something that big pharma or other philanthropic organizations are really trying to pick up the mantle to do. So making the case that it's really the NIH and the NSF that are funding the next generation of scientists. Another thing is that we play to their patriotism. When we talk about, if you're meeting with a congressman talking about America as the leader in scientific training and scientific research, and then also talking about how it's becoming much more competitive. And this seems to be a very compelling argument that we've made in multiple meetings. And finally, the other argument that's great to make is an economic argument. I've seen PIs make the argument that a lab is run like a small business, and basically they're running a company of 7 to 15 people. And I think that that's actually a really compelling argument to make, especially when you're talking about NIH and NSF money coming into a district and talking about employment. So some things that have come up that it's basically don't take the bait. And these are things that you shouldn't do in a meeting. And also trying to leave partisanship at the door is really important. So one of the things that we suggested, so we asked for last year, I forget what the raise was in NIH funding that we asked for, but a staffer turned around and asked us, where should we get the money? If I'm getting more money for the NIH or the NSF, where should I reallocate it from? And those are questions that you do not want to answer. So demurring and saying, I'm not sure, but that's something that I'm sure could be figured out, and basically not taking the bait and getting to an argument in those situations. Washington is very partisan, and sometimes if you're in meetings, it might get brought up. And it's really important to remember that they're supporters of the NIH and the NSF on both sides of the aisle, and you do not want to get into a partisan conversation. Finally, it's really important to encourage them to visit your lab. And it's, especially over congressional breaks, it's a really great photo op. We've also invited congressmen and senators to come visit our large society meetings. So if a society that you're part of has a large annual meeting, it's another great opportunity for the legislators to come and meet scientists. There's also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about community outreach that we do at Columbia. And if you're involved in that, inviting legislators to those events as well, because it's actually great for them, because it's both the public and they're meeting with scientists, and it's another really great photo op that could be put out on social media. Society for Neuroscience has advocacy tools like FASEB. We have general information, and we've gone over a lot of this already, but we have general information about the NIH, NSF, and the BRAIN Initiative available on the website. And we also have scientific funding resources that show NIH and NSF and BRAIN Initiative funding by state. Furthermore, if you want to supplement these fact sheets that are available from SFN, which I think the only thing that we're kind of adding to this story is specifically information about the BRAIN initiative. But if you're at an institution, generally you might have a dean of community or government affairs or someone filling a similar position. And we found that if you reach out to them, they'll have very specific information about funding going directly to your university. And sometimes that's a very compelling argument, especially if you are the only large research university within a district. And yeah. And once again, these sheets are great to print out and leave in the office. So they have tangible numbers. Another thing that I'm working on, independent, and we hope to have this going or have improve this in the future, but right now there's very preliminary data on it, and this is something I'm doing at Columbia independent of my work for SFN, is we started an organization called We the Scientists. And so basically we started looking at legislation that pertained to science policy, science education, and environmental legislation. And we rated that legislation based on whether or not the evidence backed up the argument that was being made in certain bills. And we compiled policy positions based upon tangible research of the issues. And so we've looked at legislation before Congress since 2013. And we believe that we've taken a relatively unbiased approach. And so we've rated legislation as good, bad, or mixed, acknowledging that a single piece of legislation can do and state multiple things, and these include large appropriations bills. And using a API available on ProPublica, we were able to tie congressmen's names to individual votes on each rated piece of legislation. And we have preliminary data compiled on fact sheets available on this website, as well as lists of each legislation, the rating that we gave it, and an explanation as to why. So if you want to go into a meeting knowing exactly how your congressman voted on a specific piece of science policy legislation, this is the beginnings of a database that we hope to be able to develop to do that. Right now, we're in the process of organizing a regional Capitol Hill Day, which kind of goes along which a lot of the advice that you were given earlier about reaching out to your districts kind of goes hand in hand about this. So we have included this year not just senators and congressmen, but city councilmen and members of the state Senate. There's a lot of legislation before local officials that does in fact oftentimes affect research. And we decided to reach out at the local level as well this year. So if you want to start building those connections as well, I highly recommend it. And yeah, so another thing to invite legislators into your lab is once again really important. And community outreach is a great way to unite both scientists, constituents, and legislators. The Society for Neuroscience partners with the Dana Foundation to host Brain Awareness Week each year. And it's a really fun event in which kids come and scientists give them fun activities that relate to the brain and teach parents and kids alike about how the brain works and some research that's going on. And so we highly encourage you, if you're interested in neuroscience, that there's great resources on this website that tell you how to host a similar event. And I think a lot of them can be translated to another field as well. If you wanted to host an outreach event in your field of research, pertaining to your field of research at your institution. And generally these have been very successful. There's also resources available for doing outreach from the Columbia University Neuroscience Outreach Group, or CUNO, and these are actually posted on the We the Scientists website. So we have two fun activities for kids that teach them about the sense of taste and teach about sensation, if this is something that you would think would be a great way to reach out to kids in your area. Oftentimes their parents come with them when we do these outreach events. And it's a great time also to speak to parents and other constituents in your districts about how science is funded and how universities and researchers exist within the district. We also have adult educational resources. Columbia runs a seminar series called Late Night Science, and we encourage people living around the medical center to come into the lab. We use Eventbrite to advertise it, and generally we have to turn people away. It's been a very popular seminar series. And so it's scientists presenting their research in plain language to a group of people, and we do a Q&A session, and we have snacks, which is very important. And then we invite members of the community into our labs. And this is something that the template that's available on this website is also a great template if you have a legislator that is going to come and visit your lab. And finally, we also have some advice on how to write an op-ed, but I'm sure the resources on FASEB are quite superior to what we put together. And so,
thank you so much, Catherine. Really appreciate all of your advice and tips here. So as we promised earlier, we are going to now allow the question and answer period to begin. Just a reminder to please use the question feature on the GoToWebinar platform. We will repeat the questions so everybody will benefit from them. In addition, I wanted to let folks know that we also are recording this webinar, and we'll have an archived version available on the FASEB website next week in case you want to rewatch it or share it with someone who couldn't be here today. So actually, the first question out of the gate, Catherine, if you don't mind, really I believe is directed to you. In your talk, you mentioned something as part of the Capitol Hill training. What exactly do you mean by don't take the bait? Could you elaborate on that?
So sometimes you might get just a zinger. So I was asked, so I gave the example of me being asked, so you're asking for an increased $2 billion to the NIH budget. So where am I going to get the money? What am I taking from? Like, what other health and human services budget am I going to strip in order to be able to add $2 billion to the NIH? And in all honesty, that is not a question that I can answer, and it's not a question that you should have to answer. So being able to demur and kind of not answer those questions, I think, is also really important.
Ben and I have actually encountered this question with some of the scientists we've taken to Capitol Hill, and sometimes you really do kind of get caught in a little bit of a hole there. One thing we've advised scientists to say is, well, you know, the one thing is we're not experts on the entire federal budget and each part of the budget. We know about biomedical research funding, which is why we're here to talk to you today. So we don't feel qualified to talk about the other parts of the budget because we don't really know exactly what the other agencies and departments do. So you can always use that as a fallback too if someone wants you to say, name a program that you want us to cut. That's one thing that you could do as well. Okay, additional questions are starting to come in now. So this one goes back to a little bit about the beginning of the presentation, but what happens to these spending bills that were approved by the committees if either the House or the Senate changes control after the midterm elections? That's a good question, and one which we're not entirely sure what happens, to be honest. So the work that was done, the bills that were approved by the committees, and even if these bills are also approved by the full House and Senate, they don't go away if something happens in November. What we do anticipate happening is that regardless of the outcome of the elections, Congress will not finish its work for the year before November. So they will have to come back for what's called a lame duck session. No plans have been announced yet about when that would take place, but we anticipate, based on what's happened previously, that sometime around Thanksgiving, all members of Congress would come back to Washington, whether or not they got reelected or whether or not they are retiring, and they will finish out the remainder of their term. Their last day of work will really be determined by the current Congress. Congress must adjourn, sine die, before the new Congress can get started. And so it'll be a conversation among the leadership. But even if your member of Congress was not reelected or was planning to retire at the end of the year, they may still have an opportunity to vote on these bills. We just can't say for sure when that might happen.
Yeah, and in addition, and as Jennifer said, usually what happens with the appropriations committees is they don't necessarily, even if there's a change of party, sort of rip up everything and start from square one. Obviously, if For example, if the Democrats take control of one or both chambers, they will have certain ideas or priorities about what they would like to spend money on that differ from the Republican Party. But an important piece of the picture here to keep in mind is that we're still operating under the Budget Control Act. And the deal that was reached, I believe it was last year, to raise the spending cap. So in terms of spending bills, the Congress is still working with sort of its own sort of finite pot of money, and thus far, with some exceptions, but by and large, the appropriations process has been sort of chugging along in a fairly bipartisan fashion. So the fact that we're still talking about a sort of overall level of spending that is not going to change for fiscal year 2019, and the way that sort of both parties have been working on these bills over the last month or two suggests that even if there is a big change in the election, that the spending process is still going to keep chugging along, and that the work they've done on the bills already will still be relevant for our advocacy efforts.
It's a similar question, kind of on the same theme. I recall that in March, Congress passed the spending bill for 2018, and it was a huge omnibus. The president at that time threatened to veto the bill and said he would never sign another bill like that again. How does this impact the 2019 discussions? Ben?
Well, it's a very good question. It is very hard to predict how these things pan out. The president, as the questioner notes, had threatened to veto, and then he didn't veto. We don't exactly know how this will impact the final discussions about FY19, but in general, the members of Congress are incentivized to try and finish the appropriations process, and the whole point of our advocacy is to push them to do that as quickly and as efficiently as possible. There's still a lot of political wrangling to come, despite everything I just said about the outcome of the elections. What happens in November still will matter in terms of people's perceptions about things and sort of what opportunities one party or another sees that they may or may not have. And so we're just going to have to keep our eye on the ball and keep pushing ahead to encourage Congress to finish the FY19 appropriations bills with these increases for science funding. That's really the most important message, and really something that they have to resolve, if not before the beginning of the fiscal year, then as soon as possible thereafter.
And again, why we're targeting this activity for this summer, so that when members of Congress go home, they hear from their constituents that, we're tired of delayed budgets. It's really disruptive to the scientific process and to scientists. And we think if we can get this message into their ears over the summer, they may be more incentivized this fall after the election to just go ahead and pass a budget. The 2018 budget was finally passed in March of this year, 6 months behind schedule. I don't think anybody was really happy with that, but we think if we can just ratchet up the public pressure, that they will eventually, by the end of the calendar year, get that done.
All right. One question asked, my university has strict rules about employees engaging in advocacy. What can I do to make sure I don't violate any of my employer's policies if I reach out to my members of Congress? Jennifer, do you have some thoughts on that one?
Well, the first thing we always advise is find out what the rules are to begin with. You can ask your department head. Most universities have at least an Office of Federal Affairs or Federal Government Relations. You can reach out to them. Deans are good people to talk to as well. So make sure that you understand what the rules are, and it's perfectly acceptable to ask for what they are. Once you get a copy of the rules, or you've been through some sort of a training session about that, one thing that you can do to be very careful is not to use any university resources as part of your advocacy activities. So if you want to email your member of Congress or send them a tweet, don't use your university computer or your university-issued tablet or cell phone to do that. Use your own personal device. We often advise engaging in these activities after your normal working hours. So if you can get a meeting on a weekend or go to a town hall meeting on a weekend, that's your own time. Some universities want you to be careful about stating your affiliation. They don't have any rules on what you can and cannot do, but they do have guidelines for things that you can say. So you may have to identify yourself as, my name is Ben Krinsky. I'm an evolutionary biologist from the University of Chicago, and talk about your role as a constituent first and a scientist, or talk about the fact that I have a PhD, but I also work at the University of Chicago. So finding out what the rules are a way to do it. And again, you're using separate devices and doing things on your own time and being pretty careful. Catherine, have you run into this situation at Columbia? And if so, how have you dealt with it?
We haven't run into this situation with respect to the outreach that we do as part of the Society for Neuroscience, but I have run into this with respect to the We the Scientists initiative that we had started. And basically all of the advice that you just gave, I also recommend. So not using your time or the school's resources in order to do these initiatives.
Great, thank you. Here's an interesting question. Every time I visit with my representative or her staff, they tell me I'm preaching to the choir, and our conversation always stalls at that point. Reaching out to my representative again this summer, it kind of seems like a waste of time. What else can I do that would really make a difference?
Well, there's a few different other avenues you can pursue, or a few different answers to this question. First, we always like to remind scientists when they're engaging in advocacy, and we actually hear this quite often. They say, well, I'm from this district with this very supportive member of Congress. I've spoken to them several times. I think it still is always worthwhile to remind your member of Congress or to remind your senator why these investments are so critical, simply because our legislators are dealing with 1,000 different things every day. They have so many different competing priorities. When it comes time to actually vote on legislation or make some kind of legislative decision, you want them to have scientific research sort of in the front of their minds. So even if they already are a champion or they already support investments in research, you want it to be sort of squarely in their thinking when they're making decisions on Capitol Hill. So a gentle reminder never hurts. Another thing we encourage you to do is as we mentioned in the course of the presentation, there are various ways to engage online, on social media, for example, sort of spreading the word about why investments in scientific research are so important. You can, of course, sort of target or tag those for your members of Congress, but something like Twitter, of course, goes to a very wide audience. So it's another way to sort of spread the word more broadly. And I would say it's also important to talk to your colleagues and your friends. You may have family members, you may have folks in other parts of the country who may have members of Congress who are not necessarily as supportive of science as your own. And so try to use your own social network to reach out to people who you know and encourage them to contact their members of Congress so that we can get as many of these legislators as possible on board with the idea that the investment in science is worthwhile.
I think that's good, solid advice. And since both FASEB and SFN have resources available, please be sure to share all of these resources when you reach out to your, friends, fellow graduate students, former lab mates, to ask them to get engaged in advocacy. Let them know that this is not something that they're going to go into without a parachute, so to speak. That we do have resources available. This one I'm going to ask Catherine to weigh in a little bit too, and we can offer some advice. But I have tried meeting with my members of Congress at home in the past, but I couldn't get anyone to respond to my request. Do you have any tips for how to get a response when the local office ignores your phone calls and emails? Catherine, have you encountered this?
We've encountered it with one office, and we're still trying again this summer. Last year, we were unable to get a meeting with one member of Congress in the city, and I think the key is really just to be persistent. Also, just trying to find any contact in the office to email as well. Also, tweeting. So social media is also pretty powerful again. So tweeting at your member of Congress or tweeting at their staffers is a great way to do it. And also looking to see if they have any public forums or town halls coming up, and beginning to ask questions there and engage in that way.
That's excellent advice. Well, the same advice we would have given the same way. Persistence pays
also,
off, and you're using. Go ahead.
Sorry, I want to add an anecdote as well. So with the graduate student tax last year, one of the members of my graduate cohort actually wrote an op-ed to basically formulated as a letter in a local newspaper in upstate New York, where she's from. And the response that she got from that, it was kind of an immediate meeting, because using powerful language in an op-ed will definitely get you noticed, especially if it's a widely circulated local journal.
That is a great story and an anecdote and another example of why the local op-eds have become such a powerful tool for advocates. One thing we do know, despite all the change in Washington, members of Congress and their staff are still reading the local newspapers, even newspapers that have switched to a digital-only format. So the old-fashioned press clippings still exist, and so that is one way that people have had success in reaching out to the members of Congress. We've got a few minutes left and a few additional questions that have come in, so I can go to those. Let's see. how can I get a member of Congress interested in visiting my lab? This can be a challenge, admittedly. One thing that is why FASEB is putting together a resource. I think one thing to do is make contact with somebody in that office, whether it's the constituent services representative or even the district scheduler. Reach out to them, issue sort of a blanket invitation to come visit the lab, and then talk about what you might do during that lab visit, so that you can say, we can look at some of the equipment that we have in the lab that's federally funded. I'd be happy to set up a roundtable with you and some of the graduate students who work in this lab to talk about their careers in science and the struggles that they've had. If you'd like to meet with other researchers at the university, we can set those meetings up as well too. So really offer them kind of a menu of options of what they can do when they come visit your lab, because it might be a little bit of a unknown experience when a politician gets a letter that says, come visit this research lab. Explain to them in great detail what they could do as part of the lab visit. Catherine, anything to add?
Sure, especially if you know that that legislator has a particular interest. I know it's kind of a letdown if they're not personally visiting your lab, but we've had success reaching out to Congressman in Maine that we found out during an office visit. His nephew was diagnosed with autism, and even though I was there with a group of researchers studying neurodegenerative disease, we were able to reach out to people at the Jackson Laboratory that study neurodevelopmental disease and try to arrange an office visit. So definitely playing to their interest is really important in doing that.
Well, that's great advice. We've now come to the 3 o'clock hour, and we promised that we would only keep you for an hour. I think in terms of the takeaways from this webinar, we hope that we've given you not only a couple reasons why you should engage in advocacy this summer, but a good look at the resources that are easily available online, and then benefiting from Catherine's personal experience that you just have to work hard at this, and you really can have some good outcomes if you stay focused and you really work on just the element of creating a relationship with elected officials and their staff. So thanks everyone for joining us. Again, we will have the archived version of this webinar with the slide deck on the FASEB website next week. And hope everyone has a great afternoon.